The drive from my little house outside Livingston to the Marlow estate above Whitefish took 4 hours and 40 minutes on a clean day, and that Saturday in early November was not a clean day. It was the kind of Montana night that made even a careful man feel as if the road had decided to become an enemy. Snow came low and hard across the windshield in silver sheets, not falling so much as driving sideways through the headlight beams, and every few miles the tires of my old blue Ford touched a place on the asphalt where the world went slick and weightless for half a second before the truck found itself again. I kept both hands on the wheel, not because I was afraid of the mountain pass, not exactly, but because my hands needed something solid to hold. The heater coughed dry air against my boots. The wipers scraped and scraped again. Outside the windows, the dark pines appeared and vanished like witnesses who did not want to be identified. I had made hard drives before. I had driven through blizzards to reach witnesses who were about to disappear, through spring floods to stand before judges who did not like waiting, through the dead black hours after a verdict when I could still hear a defendant's mother crying behind me. 31 years as a federal prosecutor teaches a man to drive when he is tired, to think when he is angry, and to keep moving when every instinct in his body says to turn back before whatever is waiting at the other end becomes real. But that night the thing pulling me north was not a witness, not a judge, not a file on my desk with a red tab across the top. It was my daughter's voice, and no weather in the world has ever scared me the way her voice scared me that morning. She had called at 6:13, early enough that I was still standing barefoot in the kitchen, waiting for the coffee to finish dripping into the pot, looking out at the frost on the back fence, and thinking about nothing more serious than whether I needed to split more wood before the first true storm. My daughter Leela never called that early unless something had gone wrong, but when I answered, she did not cry. That was the first thing that put a hook under my ribs. Leela cried when she was hurt. She had cried when her mother died, cried when she lost the first-class hamster she kept over Christmas break, cried when she found a little boy in her second-grade classroom eating lunch alone because no one would sit with him. She had her mother's softness where the world was concerned, the softness that made people underestimate both of them until they discovered there was iron under it. But when she was truly frightened, when she had decided she could not afford to fall apart because falling apart would make things worse, she went quiet. She became careful. She became the little girl who had sat beside her mother's hospital bed at 16 years old and asked the nurse in a steady voice how much morphine was too much, because she did not want to make a mistake. That was the voice I heard when she said, "Daddy, can you come up for the weekend? They're having dinner tonight. The whole family will be there. Graham says it would mean a lot if you came." Graham was my son-in-law, Graham Marlow, heir to the kind of old money in northwest Montana that likes to pretend it is not money at all but a natural feature of the landscape, like timber, rock, water, and sky. The Marlows owned land the way other families owned furniture. They had timber leases that ran through county maps like veins. They owned lake frontage on Whitefish that people in town still spoke about with lowered voices, as if acreage acquired generations ago by pressure and politics had somehow become sacred through aid. Graham's father, Prescott Marlow, was one of those men who had never been required to wonder whether a room belonged to him. He entered every space, as if the walls had been built around his future arrival. At the engagement party 2 years earlier, he had shaken my hand, asked what I did, and when I said I had retired from the United States Attorney's Office after 31 years, he had smiled without interest and said public sector, as if I had confessed to a harmless but embarrassing hobby. I knew the type. I had cross-examined the type. I had watched men like Prescott sit behind polished defense tables, while their lawyers explained why the rules that applied to other people could not possibly apply to them in the same way. Men like that were rarely stupid. Stupid men make loud mistakes. Men like Prescott make quiet ones, because they have spent their lives surrounded by people paid to soften the sound. I asked Leela what was wrong. She was quiet long enough that I could hear something move in the background, a door perhaps, or the muffled thud of someone walking across a distant room. Then she said, "Nothing, Daddy. I just want you here." That sentence was meant to end the conversation, but it opened another one inside me, one I could not ask out loud. She had not said, "I miss you." She had not said it would be nice. She had said, "I want you here." A child asks for your presence when her own presence no longer feels safe. I told her I would come. She exhaled, not with relief exactly, but with the small, involuntary sound of someone who has been holding herself upright longer than she should have had to. After we hung up, I stood there with my hand still on the phone and let the coffee run over because I had forgotten to put the pot all the way under the basket. The smell of burned coffee filled the kitchen. I cleaned it without tasting any. Then I packed a bag, fed the dog next door because Mrs. Tolly would take him for the night, put my old grey suit jacket in the back seat because Marlowe's dressed for dinner, and started north. I need to tell you about Layla before I tell you about what waited at that table, because what happened that night did not begin that night. Nothing important ever does. Leela was 29 years old, and for most of those years she had been the axis around which my life turned, though I tried not to make her feel the weight of that. Her mother, Nora, died when Leela was 16, pancreatic cancer, 8 months from the first test result to the funeral. And when Nora left us, the house changed sound. Rooms do that. People think grief is silence, but grief is not silence. Grief is every missing noise becoming louder. Nora's slippers not brushing the hall outside the bedroom. Nora not singing badly in the pantry. Nora not saying my name from the other room in the tone that meant I had forgotten something obvious. After the funeral, it was just Leela and me in a house that had been built for 3 voices, and now had 2 people trying not to echo. I cooked spaghetti so badly she still jokes about it. She taught me how to braid her hair because she said showing up at school with a ponytail every day made her feel like I had surrendered. I went to parent-teacher conferences and learned to sit in the chairs designed for children without letting my knees crack too loudly. She went to college at Montana State, got her teaching degree, took a job in Belgrade, and became the kind of teacher children remember 20 years later when they are trying to name the first adult who made them feel seen. Then Graham came into her life at a fundraiser for the volunteer fire department, of all places. He was tall, easy, handsome in the polished way of men who have never had to wonder whether their shoes were appropriate for the room. He knew how to listen just long enough to make a woman feel chosen, and how to speak just softly enough that she had to lean toward him. I did not dislike him at first. I was cautious, but caution is not the same as dislike. He brought flowers the first time he came to dinner. He helped clear the plates, although he did it with the faint confusion of a man who knew the gesture mattered, but had not often handled actual dishes. He asked me about my career and seemed interested until I mentioned public corruption cases, at which point his eyes changed. Not much, just enough. People who have nothing to hide are usually bored by corruption. People who know exactly how corruption works become attentive in a different way. Layla was happy. That mattered. I had spent so many years trying not to become the kind of father who fills his daughter's future with his own suspicions that when she smiled at him across my kitchen table, I swallowed what I saw and told myself every man looks imperfect under a prosecutor's light. They were engaged after 8 months and married after 14. The wedding was at the Marlowe estate, of course, because everything in that family had to take place where the family name could surround it. 300 guests arrived in black cars and polished boots. There was a string quartet on the lawn, a flower arch taller than my garage, and a tent with chandeliers suspended from steel rigging disguised in white fabric. I wore a rented tuxedo and felt like a man who had wandered into someone else's trial by mistake. Leela looked beautiful, and when she caught my eye during the reception, she mouthed, "I love you, Daddy." I held that like a small warm coal all night. Prescott gave a toast that managed to mention legacy 6 times and Leela's name twice. Graham laughed at everything his father said, even the parts that were not jokes. Nora would have noticed that. Nora noticed men through their laughter. She used to say you could tell whether a man was free by whether he laughed before or after deciding it was safe. I noticed it too, but only later, when the memory came back with teeth. The estate rose above Whitefish Lake like a lodge, designed by someone who wanted nature to admit defeat. Stone chimneys, cedar beams, enormous windows facing the water. A long gravel drive lined with low iron lights that looked more like a private approach to power than a driveway. I pulled in a little after 11 that morning, snow clinging to the truck's wheel wells, and before I had turned off the engine, the front door opened and Leela came outside. She moved fast, too fast, as if she had been waiting where no one could see her, and had bolted the moment she heard my truck. She wore a cream turtleneck pulled high under her jaw, a long cardigan, and sleeves that covered her hands almost to the knuckles. It was November, yes, but my daughter ran warm. As a child, she kicked blankets off in February. Her mother used to put a hand on her forehead and say, "This girl has a furnace in her bones." Now she was wrapped like someone hiding from air. She hugged me hard and then flinched so sharply she tried to turn it into a cough. It was a small movement, the kind most people would miss because they do not expect love to hurt. I did not miss it. Her body tightened under my arm, then loosened through force. I held her at arm's length and looked at her face. She had put makeup under her eyes, not much, but enough to cover something tired. She smiled quickly and said, "You made good time," as if we were discussing whether or not whatever had hollowed out her voice. I said, "Leila." She tucked her left hand inside the crook of her right elbow. She had done that since she was 4 whenever she lied to protect someone else. When she broke Nora's blue vase and blamed the cat. When she snuck to a party at 15 and said she had been studying. When she told me she was fine the night after her mother's funeral because she thought I was too tired to carry one more truth. She was doing it now. For 1 second her sleeve rode up, and I saw an ace bandage wrapped around her wrist, beige against her skin, tight enough to leave a ridge. Her eyes followed mine. The smile stayed on her mouth and died everywhere else. "Please, Daddy," she said softly. "Not now. Just come inside." So I went inside, because I had spent enough years with victims to know that the first rescue a frightened person needs is often not a rescue at all, but control over the next 5 minutes. The foyer smelled of pine smoke, beeswax, and money. A mounted elk head looked down over the staircase. Graham appeared from the hallway wearing a cable knit sweater, and the relieved expression of a man happy to see reinforcements arrive for a performance already underway. "Calvin," he said, using my first name because Marlowe's did not like giving anyone the dignity of titles, unless the title belonged to them. "Good to have you. The old man has been asking." He clapped my shoulder in the way younger men do when they are trying to establish easy dominance without admitting they are doing it. His palm lingered a fraction too long. I looked at his hand, then at him, and he removed it. It was a small exchange, nothing anyone else would have understood, but his eyes flicked toward Leila and then away. Fear leaves tracks even when men try to cover them. Prescott was in the great room with a glass of bourbon in his hand, at 11:30 in the morning. He sat near the fireplace in a leather chair that looked less like furniture than a throne someone had modernized for hunting season. His wife, Vivian, sat on a sofa nearby with a magazine open in her lap, though her eyes were not moving. Vivian Marlowe was a thin woman with silver hair and the careful stillness of someone who had learned decades ago that silence could be mistaken for grace. She looked at me when I entered, and for a moment I thought she might say something genuine, but Prescott spoke first. "Calvin," he gave me the same handshake he had given me at the engagement party. "Up, down, finished. Drove through the mess, did you?" I said I did. "Roads bad." I said some. He looked me over, jeans, flannel, boots, old jacket over my arm, and said, "Dinner is at 7. We dress." I told him I brought a jacket. He made a sound that was not quite approval and not quite dismissal, then turned back to the fire as if I had completed the portion of the visit that involved being acknowledged. The afternoon moved like a stage play, in which everyone knew their lines except me and my daughter. I asked Leila if she wanted to walk down to the lake with me. She opened her mouth, and before she could answer, Vivian appeared beside her with a hand on her elbow. "Leila, darling, the flowers need checking in the dining room, and Cook is asking about the service order." It was said softly, but it was not a request. Leila looked at me once, apologetic and ashamed, which made my anger begin somewhere deep and cold. She followed Vivian down the hallway. Graham suggested I watch the game with him and his father. I sat in the den under framed photographs of men in hunting gear standing over dead animals, and I listened to Prescott shout at the television with a kind of proprietary outrage, as if even professional football owed him better service. Every time a housekeeper entered with ice or glasses or food, his voice changed. Not louder, sharper. He did not thank them, he corrected. "More ice, not those glasses. Tell your sister the fire in the east room needs attention." Once a young woman carrying a tray paused, because Graham had shifted his chair into her path. Prescott snapped his fingers once, not at her exactly but near her, and said, "Around, girl." She went around. Graham laughed into his drink. I watched. The Marlowe house operated on invisible pressure. Nothing was said directly if it could be arranged through posture, glance, pause, or correction. Vivian could move a vase 3 inches and make a room feel accused. Graham could place a hand at the small of Leila's back in front of others and make it look tender while steering her away from any conversation that did not suit him. Prescott could lower his glass onto a table and make everyone hear that something had displeased him. I saw Leila cross the den twice in the afternoon. The first time she carried a stack of folded napkins, though there were 3 staff members visible in the hall. The second time she came to ask whether Prescott preferred the Bordeaux opened early. He did not look at her when he answered. He said, "You tell me, sweetheart, you seem to have opinions today." Her face changed so quickly most people might have called it confusion. It was not confusion. It was the body bracing for impact before it knows where the blow is coming from. Graham looked down at his glass. No one else spoke. Leela said, "I will ask Cook," and left. At 3:20, I excused myself and went looking for her. I found her in the pantry off the kitchen, sitting on a step stool between shelves of preserves and imported olive oil, one sleeve pushed up while she tried to rewrap the bandage around her wrist using her teeth and her good hand. She froze when she saw me. The bandage hung loose. Her wrist was exposed. The bruise was unmistakable. A large hand, 4 long marks wrapping around the outside, and a deep thumb mark near the inside bone, green at the edges, yellow beneath, with that dark wine stain in the center where the pressure had been hardest. I had seen bruises like that in evidence photographs. I had held them up in court. I had asked doctors to explain how long the grip must have lasted, how much force must have been applied, what kind of fear keeps a person still while someone's fingers close around them. Seeing it on my daughter did something to time. The pantry narrowed. The sound of voices in the kitchen receded. All the years between her first cry in the hospital and that bruise seemed to collapse into one impossible second. She tried to pull her sleeve down. I crossed the pantry, lowered myself onto one knee in front of her despite the complaint from both joints, and took her uninjured hand between mine. Her fingers were cold. I said, "Tell me." She shook her head. "Daddy, please." I said, "Tell me who." She looked at the door, then back at me. That glance told me the house had trained her to measure walls for ears. Finally, she whispered, "Prescott, not Graham. Prescott." She swallowed and looked ashamed of the sound of his name. Tuesday morning at breakfast, I poured his coffee before Graham's. I didn't know there was an order. He said, "In this house, a woman learns the table before she sits at it." I tried to laugh because I thought he was joking, and then he grabbed me. He grabbed my wrist and pulled me close enough that I could smell the bourbon on him, even though it was breakfast. And he said nobody had taught me how to serve a man properly. Her breath caught once, but she forced it down. Graham was sitting right there, Daddy. He was sitting right there with his eggs getting cold. And he looked at his plate like if he stared hard enough, I would disappear. I did not speak for a while. I could feel her waiting for the explosion. She knew the part of me that had once stood before juries and built cages around violent men one fact at a time. She expected that man to rise immediately and go hunting through the house. But fatherhood, when it is real, is not the same as rage. Rage belongs to you. Protection belongs to the person who is hurt. I asked if Prescott had done it before. She said, "Not like that." I asked what that meant. She rubbed her thumb against the seam of her cardigan until the fabric twisted. "He grabs people. He grabs Vivian by the elbow when she interrupts. He grabs staff by the shoulder if they are in his way. He grabbed me once after the wedding because I put a serving spoon in the wrong bowl. It was quick. I thought maybe I was being sensitive. Graham said that is just how his father is. Everybody says that here. That is just how he is." She looked at me then, and there was something worse than fear in her face. There was embarrassment. She was ashamed that she had accepted the explanation for as long as she had. She said, "I kept thinking if I learned the rules, it would stop. But there are always more rules. I do one thing right, and another thing appears. Don't speak too much. Don't go quiet. Don't wear that color at breakfast. Don't correct Graham in front of his father. Don't mention school because Prescott thinks teaching is charitable work, not real work. Don't call you too often because Graham says it makes me look childish. Don't laugh like that because Vivian says it draws attention. Don't cry because Prescott hates women who cry. Don't flinch because it makes him angry. Daddy, I don't know how to be in this house without doing something wrong. The middle of a breaking life is not dramatic. That is what people fail to understand. It is not one blow, one scream, one night. It is 1,000 tiny corrections until the person begins correcting herself before anyone else can. It is watching a woman who once stood in my kitchen with spaghetti sauce on her cheek and laughed, until she had to sit on the floor now fold herself smaller to avoid disturbing expensive air. I asked where Graham was when these rules were enforced. She closed her eyes. Sometimes he says he will talk to them. Sometimes he says I need to be patient. Sometimes he says I take things too personally. Sometimes he gets angry at me after Prescott humiliates me, because he says I put him in a difficult position. She opened her eyes again. Last month I told him I wanted to spend a weekend with you, just us, and he said it would look bad because his family had guests coming. I said I missed you. He said, Leela, your father is lonely and you enable it. I did not know a sentence could make me feel guilty for loving you. I breathed through my nose because if I opened my mouth too quickly, I would say something that belonged to anger, not strategy. I asked her what she wanted from me tonight. Her face changed. She had been afraid of that question too. She said, I want you to sit through dinner. Please do not start something before dinner. If you do, they will say, I brought you here to cause a scene. They will say, I exaggerated. They will say you are a retired prosecutor who needs a case. Graham will be humiliated. Prescott will be furious. I just need someone in the room who knows I am not crazy. She pressed her lips together until they went pale. I know how that sounds. It sounds weak. I said, it sounds like someone trying to survive tonight. She lowered her head. I said, I will sit through dinner. She looked up fast, almost disbelieving. I said, but after dinner, when we say goodnight, you come down to the guest room for 1 minute. You tell them you want to say goodnight to your old dad. You bring whatever you cannot leave behind in a small bag, if you can do it without being noticed. If you cannot, we come back for it later. Do you understand? She whispered yes. I said, and if he touches you again at that table, the schedule changes. She stared at me. I said, I am not promising silence if another hand lands on you. Her eyes filled, but she did not let the tears fall. She nodded. I helped her wrap the bandage again, careful not to touch the worst part of the bruise. When I stood, my knees made an old man's sound, and she laughed despite everything. It was small, cracked, real. For 2 seconds, I saw my daughter inside the house's shadow. Then the pantry door opened, and Vivian stood there. She looked from me to Leela's bandage, and then to the shelves, as if searching for the least dangerous version of what she had interrupted. Prescott wants the burgundy decanted, she said. Leela stood immediately. I watched that too. Not a daughter-in-law responding to a request, a servant responding to a bell. Vivian's eyes met mine for 1 second, and in them I saw knowledge. Not surprise, not confusion, knowledge and resignation. That was when I understood that the bruise on Leela's wrist was not an incident in that house. It was part of a climate. I returned to the den and spent the next 3 hours gathering the kind of evidence no camera captures. Prescott drank steadily but did not slur. That told me he practiced. Graham checked his phone every few minutes and smiled at messages he did not share. When Leela entered with Vivian to confirm seating arrangements, Graham's eyes moved first to her wrist, then to his father, then to me. He knew what I had seen. His face held the nervous irritation of a man whose secret had become inconvenient. Prescott, on the other hand, watched me watch him. He seemed amused. Men like him enjoy having an audience when they believe the audience cannot touch them. He asked me about retirement. I said it was quiet. He said quiet kills a man faster than work. I said depends what kind of work he has done. He smiled. He asked if I missed putting people in prison. I said I missed the clarity of consequences. Graham laughed too quickly, then stopped when no one joined him. By the time dinner was called, the house felt like a storm cellar. Everyone came polished and prepared. I put on my grey suit jacket in the guest room and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked older than I felt, but not weak. I looked like a man who had learned how much damage could be done by speaking too soon, and how much more could be done by waiting. On the dresser, I placed my phone face down with the recorder running, then thought better of it, slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket, and let it continue. In my career, I had learned that memory is honest, but evidence is better. Then I went down. The dining room was long, paneled in dark wood, lit by an iron chandelier and candles that made every glass throw small blades of light onto the table. 11 people sat down, Prescott at the head, Vivian at the foot, Graham and Leela along one side. I sat across from them. Graham's older sister, Elise, was there with her husband, a quiet orthopedic surgeon who had the drained look of a man who had learned to disappear inside his own marriage. Two cousins, a retired uncle, and the family attorney, Martin Vale, completed the table. Vale had silver hair, rimless glasses, and the empty courtesy of a man who had converted other people's secrets into billable hours for 30 years. The housekeeper served soup. Leela sat straight, her left hand hidden in her lap. The conversation began with timber markets, drifted to county politics, touched briefly on a lakefront neighbor whose new glass addition was described as vulgar by people sitting under a chandelier large enough to land a helicopter on. I ate the soup. It was too salty. I listened. Pressure cycles have rhythm. At first the table tried to behave as if I were simply a visiting father. Prescott asked the uncle about elk. Elise mentioned a charity auction. Graham told a story about a client who had confused market volatility with opportunity, and everyone laughed, though the story had no shape. Leela took small spoonfuls and looked at no one for too long. Then Prescott corrected Vivian for reaching for the wrong wine. A minor thing, a little tightening in the room. Vivian apologized, though she had done nothing requiring apology. The room relaxed again. Then Graham touched Leela's knee under the table, not affectionately, but in warning when she nearly answered a question directed at him. I saw her mouth close around the words. The room relaxed again. Then Prescott asked Leela whether she had managed not to confuse the seating cards this time, and a cousin smiled down at his plate. Leela said, I checked them twice. Prescott said, good girl. The room did not relax after that. It waited. 20 minutes into dinner, Leela reached for her water glass with her left hand. She forgot herself for 1 second, which told me she was exhausted. The sleeve of her dress slid back, and the edge of the bandage showed. Prescott saw it before anyone else. His eyes sharpened with pleasure. He set down his fork very carefully, leaned back, and looked across the table at me. Calvin, he said, your daughter took a little tumble this week, walked into a door frame, according to her. Raised her clumsy, did you? There was polite laughter, brittle and obedient. Leela's face flushed from the base of her throat to her ears. Graham stared at his plate. I looked at Prescott and said, that does not look like a door frame. The laughter stopped before it fully died, leaving the sound of silverware against china too loud in the room. Prescott lifted his eyebrows. A medical opinion now. Federal service is broader than I imagined. I said, I have seen a few bruises. He said, I am sure you have. Government work after all. He let that sit, then turned his attention to Lila in a way that made the room lean away without moving. Sweetheart, show your father you are fine. Layla did not move. Graham whispered her name, but not as comfort, as instruction. Prescott smiled at me. We are all still learning manners here. Your girl came to us from modest circumstances, and there is no shame in that. None at all. But families like ours have ways of doing things. Standards, rituals. A woman entering a house like this has to learn where she is. He reached across the corner of the table and took Leela's left wrist. Not hard enough to make her cry out. That would have been crude. He was subtler than that. He placed his fingers directly over the bruise, wrapping them where they had wrapped before, and held her wrist up slightly so the bandage pressed into the damaged skin. Leela's shoulders tightened, and her eyes went enormous, not from the pain alone but from the publicness of it, from the realization that he was not hiding what he had done. He was displaying it. He looked at me while holding her. We are teaching her, he said. Every sound in the room became distinct. The fire shifted in the hearth. Someone drew a breath and held it. A wine glass clicked once against a tooth. Graham did not move. He did not lift his head. In that suspended moment, I saw the architecture of the entire family. Prescott's hand on my daughter, Vivian's silence, Graham's cowardice, Vale's calculation, the others pretending their stillness was shock, when in truth it was practice. I picked up my napkin from my lap. I folded it once, then again, because my hands needed an action that was not violence. I set it beside my plate. I looked at Leela first. I gave her the smallest nod I could. Then I looked at Prescott Marlowe and said, take your hand off my daughter. He laughed. Or what, old man? You going to prosecute me over dinner? I said, take your hand off my daughter. He squeezed just slightly. I saw Leela's face go white. I said, I want you to consider the next 30 seconds carefully. I want you to release her wrist, apologize to her, and sit quietly while I speak to this table. If you do those things, the rest of your life may continue in a form you recognize. If you do not, the rest of your life begins changing at approximately 7:30 Monday morning. Prescott's smile thinned. Are you threatening me in my house? I said no. I am offering you a courtesy because my daughter loves your son, though I am struggling to understand why. You are a guest here. I am her father. That outranks you. Release her. The quiet did what anger could not have done. Men like Prescott build whole fortresses against shouting. They know how to mark it, escalate it, turn it into proof of instability. Quiet unsettles them, because quiet suggests the decision has already been made elsewhere. His fingers opened. Leela pulled her hand back into her lap so quickly the water in her glass trembled. I said, thank you. Now apologize to her. Prescott's face darkened. I will not be spoken to like this. I said, apologize to her. Graham finally looked up, and what I saw in his face was not outrage at his father or concern for his wife. It was panic that the table had stopped obeying its usual rules. He said, Calvin, maybe we should all take a breath. I turned to him. Your wife has been hurt in front of you twice now, once at breakfast and once at dinner, and those are only the times I know about. This is not the moment for you to moderate. It is the moment for you to decide whether you are a husband or a witness. He looked as if I had slapped him. Leela made a small sound, not quite a sob. Prescott stood halfway from his chair. Get out. His voice had dropped. Get out of my house. I remained seated. I looked at Martin Vale. Mr. Vale, I said, you know who I am. Vale's expression did not change, but his hand moved away from his wine glass. I said, you looked me up when Leela and Graham got engaged. Someone in this family would have insisted, and you are the man paid to make curiosity look professional. So you know I spent 31 years in the United States Attorney's Office. You know I served as Deputy Chief of the Criminal Division for 12. You know the people I trained. You know which people I still speak to. If you would like, you may explain that to the table. Vale said nothing. Prescott barked, Martin, do not answer him. I said, Martin is smart enough not to answer questions he does not have to. Then I turned back to Prescott. Here is what happens now. I am leaving this table. Layla is leaving with me. She will pack a bag and come home to Livingston tonight. She will stay there as long as she wants. You will not contact her directly. Graham, if he has anything worth saying, can say it through counsel after he finds some. On Monday morning, I will make one phone call to a man I trained 22 years ago, a man who is now United States Attorney for this district. I will ask him to take a fresh look at an old file involving timber lease bidding on federal land in the Flathead region, dating back to 2009. I will tell him there was once a witness who got frightened, a subcontractor who decided his memory was less reliable after a visit from men associated with your company, and a file that went quiet for reasons that had more to do with resources than innocence. Files do not die, Mr. Marlowe, they wait. The change in him was extraordinary because it was involuntary. His face went from red to pale in stages, like blood draining from a cloth. The room seemed to understand before he did that something had shifted from family cruelty to federal exposure. He said, you have nothing. I said, I need almost nothing. I need a file number, a phone call, and your reaction in this room, which has been educational. Vale stood, but slowly. Prescott, perhaps we should adjourn. Prescott snapped, sit down. Vale did not sit. That was when everyone else at the table understood. The attorney had stopped obeying. I stood. The chair legs made a clean scrape against the floor. I looked at Leila. Sweetheart, get your coat. She rose as if her body had been waiting for permission from someone who loved her more than he feared them. Graham said her name. She stopped at the doorway and turned. He looked younger than his age, suddenly softer and smaller in his father's house. Layla, please, he said. Don't do this. She stared at him for a long moment, and in her face I saw Nora so clearly it nearly took my breath. She said, he grabbed me at breakfast and you ate your eggs. He flinched. She said, tonight he did it again, and you asked everyone to breathe. That is what I am leaving, not the house. You. Then she walked out. Upstairs, her bedroom looked like a luxury hotel room no one had ever slept peacefully in. Her clothes were arranged by color behind closet doors taller than the doorway of the house I raised her in. A framed wedding photograph stood on the dresser, Leela smiling under a veil, Graham looking handsome and certain, Prescott in the background with his hand on his son's shoulder like an owner beside a horse. Leila moved through the room shaking. At first she put random things into a suitcase. One shoe, 2 books, a folded sweater she did not need. Trauma makes people pack symbols instead of necessities. I gently took the suitcase, set it on the bed and said, "We need clothes for a week, medicine, documents, chargers, anything of your mother's, anything you cannot replace. We will leave the rest." She nodded too quickly. Her hands would not obey her. I opened drawers and asked before touching anything personal. She found Nora's ring in a small ceramic dish and closed her fist around it. She found a photograph of her mother tucked in the nightstand drawer beneath a devotional book Vivian had given her and she had never read. When she saw it, she sat on the edge of the bed and folded over it, not crying loudly, just breaking inward. I knelt again because apparently that day intended to test every joint I owned. I said, "We are leaving." She said, "I should have called you sooner." I said, "You called when you could." She said, "I let it happen." I said, "No, they made it happen and you survived until you could live. Those are not the same thing." At the bottom of the stairs, Martin Vale waited in the foyer without a coat, his polished shoes absurd against the draft coming under the front door. I walked Leila to the truck first. The snow had stopped, but the air was sharp. I settled her in the passenger seat, turned the heater high, and told her to lock the door until I came back. Then I returned to the porch. Vale stood with his hands clasped in front of him, a man trying to decide whether conscience could be billed retroactively. "Mr. Rourke," he said a word. I waited. He looked toward the dark windows. "Was it true about the old file?" I said, "Yes." "Is it strong?" I said, "It was not strong enough then. It may be strong enough now." He absorbed that. Then he said, "The bruised. There have been others, not only your daughter. Steph, Vivian once, years ago." His voice lowered. "I have advised restraint." I looked at him until he had to look away. Advised restraint is what men say when they want credit for noticing harm without risking anything to stop it. He swallowed. I said, "I am going to give you advice for free. Walk away from this family tonight. Send a termination letter by Tuesday. Do not be counsel of record when the knock comes, because a knock is coming." He looked old then, older than Prescott somehow. He said, "I thought I could manage them." I said, "That is what every lawyer thinks right before the client becomes evidence." We left the Marlowe estate at 8:43. Leila cried for the first hour, the kind of crying that comes when the body realizes it is no longer required to hold itself together for enemies. I drove with one hand on the wheel and one hand resting near her, not touching unless she reached first. Outside Kalispell, I stopped at a gas station and bought her coffee and powdered donuts because when she was 6, after every dentist appointment, she demanded powdered donuts as compensation for bravery. I handed them to her without comment. She looked at the package, laughed once through tears and said, "You remembered." I said, "I am old, not dead." That was the second real laugh I had heard from her in 2 days. It hurt and helped at the same time. We reached Livingston after 1 in the morning. The house was cold because I had banked the fire badly before leaving. Leila stood in the hallway looking at the walls, as if she had returned from another country. Her old bedroom was exactly as she had left it, in pieces, not preserved like a museum, but still holding the marks of her becoming. A blue quilt, a shelf of paperbacks, a framed photograph of her and Nora at the county fair, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. She touched the doorknob and whispered, "I thought I had outgrown this room." I said, "Rooms do not take offense." She slept in her clothes under the quilt. I sat on the edge of the bed until her breathing steadied, because fathers return to old duties without being asked. Then I went to the kitchen, made coffee I did not drink, and placed the call. The man who answered was named Daniel Mercer, though I still thought of him as Danny because he had come to me 22 years earlier, fresh out of law school with a tie too wide and a conscience so earnest it made older attorneys nervous. He was now United States Attorney for the District of Montana. When he heard my voice at 2:15 on a Sunday morning, he did not make a joke. He said, "Calvin, what happened?" I told him I had a daughter asleep down the hall with a handprint on her wrist. Then I told him about Prescott Marlowe. I told him about the old timber lease file, the irregular bids, the shell subcontractors, the witness who had recanted after a private visit, the internal memo I had kept in my personal archive because sometimes a case fails without becoming false. Danny listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, send me everything Monday morning. I said, I will send it in 3 hours. He said, Calvin, are you all right? I looked down the hall toward my daughter's closed door. I said, I will be when she is. The next weeks were not healing. I want that understood. People like clean arcs, harm, courage, justice, recovery. Life is not so respectful of narrative. Leela stayed in my house and moved through it like someone recovering from a long illness that had no name. Some mornings she woke before dawn and cleaned already clean counters because stillness made her panic. Some afternoons she sat on the floor beside the dog and stared at nothing until I asked whether she wanted tea, and she would say yes without drinking it. Graham called the first day, then the second. Then he sent messages that moved through predictable stages. Concern, confusion, hurt, irritation, accusation. He wrote that she had embarrassed him. He wrote that his father had been under stress. He wrote that families have private ways of resolving things. He wrote that I had manipulated her. He wrote that if she loved him, she would come back and talk like an adult. Leela read some of them and deleted others without opening them. The first time she blocked his number, her thumb hovered over the button for nearly a minute. Then she pressed it, and we both sat in the kitchen listening to the furnace click on. Prescott did not call. That told me his lawyers had started earning their money. Vivian sent flowers with no card. Leela threw them away herself, then cried afterward because throwing away flowers felt cruel even when keeping them felt worse. On the third week, she went back to her classroom. I drove her the first morning because she asked me to, though she was 29 and perfectly capable of driving. She sat in the passenger seat, twisting Nora's ring around her finger. Outside the school, she watched children walking in with backpacks bouncing against their coats, and something in her face cracked open. I said, you can wait another week. She shook her head. If I wait until I am not afraid, I will never go. She got out. At 3:30, she came home with a stack of cards from her students. Welcome back, Miss Rook. We missed you. I like your hair. One card had a drawing of a dinosaur saying, do not be sad. She taped them to the fridge one by one and laughed at the misspellings until she had to sit down. 91 days after that dinner, the grand jury returned an indictment against Prescott Marlowe on 17 counts, including bid rigging, wire fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. When the news broke, Whitefish seemed to divide itself into people who had always known and people who claimed they could not possibly have imagined. That is how powerful men fall in public, slowly in private, then suddenly in headlines. Martin Vale had withdrawn as counsel before the indictment, which did not save his reputation but may have saved his license. The replacement lawyers were expensive, aggressive, and not nearly as calm as they wanted to look. The trial took 6 weeks. I did not sit in the courtroom every day. I was not part of the prosecution team, and I had no desire to haunt younger lawyers by becoming a ghost from their training manuals. But I testified once about the old file and the witness who had finally decided that age made him less afraid than guilt. Prescott sat at the defense table wearing a dark suit and the expression of a man personally offended by accountability. He did not look at me when I walked past him. That was wise. Men like him mistake eye contact for leverage until they meet someone who has none left to give. He was convicted on most counts and sentenced to 11 years in a federal facility outside Sheridan, Wyoming. Not enough for everything he had done, perhaps, but enough to remove him from the table where he had believed himself permanent. Graham was not indicted. The office determined he had not been substantially involved in the timber matters, and I did not interfere. That decision belonged to them. Leela filed for divorce 11 days after we left Whitefish. The Marlowes fought because families like that mistake surrender for infection. Graham signed affidavits saying she had become emotionally unstable under my influence. Leela's attorney answered with photographs of the bruise, messages from Graham, and a sworn statement from a former housekeeper who described Prescott's behavior in the home. The divorce took 9 months. She asked for no money beyond what was hers. She returned the Marlowe wedding gifts. She kept Nora's ring, her books, her classroom supplies, and the old blue quilt from my spare room. She said she did not want anything that smelled like that house. The ending was colder than people expected. There was no grand reconciliation. Graham sent one final letter 6 months after the divorce, handwritten, 3 pages, apologizing in language that managed to be both sincere and cowardly. Leela read it at the kitchen table. Her face did not change. When she finished, she folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I asked what she wanted to do with it. She said nothing. Not burn it. Not answer it. Not keep it somewhere meaningful. Just nothing. She put it in a drawer with takeout menus and old batteries, and somehow that seemed more final than fire. She lives in a small apartment now, close to her school, with uneven floors and windows that rattle in wind. She sleeps better than she did, but not the way she slept before. She laughs again, but sometimes her laughter stops suddenly, as if it has bumped against a memory in the room. She has dinner with me on Sundays. Sometimes we cook spaghetti badly on purpose. Sometimes she talks about her students. Sometimes she sits quietly with the dog's head in her lap and says nothing for an hour. A history teacher from her school has asked her to coffee twice. She has not gone yet. She says maybe someday. I do not push. Surviving is not the same as being restored, and any man who tells you otherwise is selling something. I think often about the table in that house, about the weight of my napkin in my hand, about the exact sound it made when I set it down beside my plate. That sound is still with me. Not the verdict, not the headline, not the sentence, the napkin, the small domestic sound of a man deciding that silence had ended. I spent 31 years believing justice was a system, and it is on its best days. But before justice becomes a system, it is a moment, a wrist held too tightly, a room pretending not to see, a father folding a napkin, because if he does not give his hands something gentle to do, they may choose something else. Prescott Marlowe believed his name made him the man at the table. Graham believed fear excused him from becoming one. Martin Vale believed knowledge without action could remain professional. Vivian believed endurance was the same as peace. My daughter believed for a while that if she learned every rule, she could make cruelty stop changing shape. I believed I could protect her by being nearby. We were all wrong in different ways. The ledger keeps itself. That is what I know now more than ever. Every cruelty enters somewhere. Every silence does too. The bill may not come when the harmed person needs it. It may not come in a form that feels clean or complete. Sometimes the man goes to prison and the daughter still wakes at 3 in the morning, with her hand closed around a wrist that no one is touching. Sometimes the house by the lake keeps standing after the family inside it has rotted out. Sometimes survival looks less like victory than like a woman taping children's misspelled cards to a refrigerator while trying to remember how to breathe in a room nobody owns but her. I am her father. I stood up when the time came. I wish I had seen enough to stand sooner. That wish is a cold thing, and it has taken up permanent residence in me. Last week Leela called and asked if I would help her pick out a dress for a school banquet. I am, without question, the worst dress picker in the state of Montana. Nora used to say I thought navy blue was a personality. But Leela asked, so I went. We stood in a store under fluorescent lights while she held up colors and made faces at herself in the mirror. At one point, she came out wearing a dark green dress with sleeves that ended above the wrist. She stood very still. The bruise was long gone, but her eyes went to the place where it had been. Mine did too, though I tried not to let her see. She saw anyway. She lifted her chin and said, I think this one. I said, your mother would have liked the green. Her mouth trembled once, then steadied. She bought it. On the drive home, snow started falling lightly against the windshield. Soft this time, harmless for the moment. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then she reached over and put her hand on my arm. Not because she was afraid. Not because she needed rescue. Just because I was there. I kept my eyes on the road and let her hand rest there as long as she wanted. That is where the story leaves us. Not healed, not whole. Not shining with some easy lesson, but still here. A father in an old truck. A daughter learning the shape of her own life again. A powerful man counting years in a federal cell. A weak man living with the knowledge that when his wife needed him, he studied his plate. A house above a frozen lake with fewer voices in it than before. The world does not balance cleanly. It never has. But sometimes, if you are lucky, if you are prepared, if you have lived long enough to know that rage is useful only after it has been harnessed, you get one clear moment to put your napkin on the table, look directly at the hand doing harm, and say in a voice steady enough to be remembered, take your hand off my daughter. After that, everything is paperwork, and the cold, permanent work of living with what the moment cost. There are parts of that weekend I did not understand until months later, because the mind protects itself from full knowledge until the body can stand the weight. At first I thought the harm in that house had been centered on Prescott, one cruel old man with too much power and too little resistance around him, but that was only the easiest shape to name. The longer Leela stayed with me, the more details surfaced, not in dramatic confessions but in ordinary moments that broke open without warning. She would be standing at the sink rinsing a coffee mug, and suddenly say that Vivian had once taken her aside before a luncheon and told her not to use her hands when she spoke because it made her look provincial. She would be folding towels and remember that Graham had started checking her texts by saying he was only trying to help her manage the family calendar, then slowly turning that help into permission. She would stop in the middle of a grocery aisle because the smell of expensive cedar soap reminded her of Prescott's study, where he had called her in one afternoon to ask why she had declined a club invitation on behalf of herself and Graham, without first consulting the family schedule. She told me he had not raised his voice that day. He had not touched her. He had simply sat behind his desk, let silence collect until she began explaining too much, then said, "Leela, you are not in a classroom here. Nobody is impressed by your little explanations." The sentence had lived under her skin for months. I could see it when she told me. Her face had the look of someone ashamed that words alone had hurt her, as if bruises were the only evidence she had permission to bring. The first month after she left, she apologized constantly. She apologized for using too much hot water. She apologized for leaving a spoon in the sink. She apologized when she cried, apologized when she did not cry, apologized when I made her breakfast and when she could not eat it. The apologies were not manners. They were reflexes installed by a house where every need had been treated as an inconvenience, and every mistake as proof of defective breeding. One morning I found her standing in front of the washing machine at 6, holding a damp sweater in both hands, frozen. I asked what was wrong. She said she had washed it on warm and it might shrink. I told her it was just a sweater. She looked at me with a kind of terror that made me regret the word just. In the Marlowe house, there had been no just. There had been lessons, standards, disappointments, subtle punishments, long silences. I took the sweater gently and laid it flat on a towel. I said, "We will let it dry, and if it shrinks, we will put it on the dog and make him look ridiculous." She laughed, then cried, then apologized for crying. I said, "You do not have to apologize for leaking after someone has been holding you underwater." She looked at me for a long time after that, and I knew she had heard me, but hearing a thing and believing it are separated by a long road. I also learned about Graham in pieces, which was fitting because cowardice rarely announces itself as one complete structure. It appears as a series of reasonable hesitations. Leela told me he had not been cruel in the beginning. That mattered to her. She repeated it often, as if trying to defend the part of herself that had loved him. He had been attentive, funny, patient with her grief, fascinated by her classroom stories. He had once driven 2 hours in a snowstorm to bring her soup when she had the flu. He remembered Nora's birthday the first year they were together, and sent flowers to the cemetery with Layla. Those things had been real, she said. I believed her. Harm does not require that every tender thing be false. Sometimes the tenderness is the hook. Sometimes a man can love you in the portions of himself that are not governed by fear and still abandon you the moment loving you costs him his place at his father's table. Graham's tragedy, if I am willing to grant him that word, was that he had mistaken obedience for survival so completely that he could no longer recognize the difference between peace and surrender. When Prescott insulted Layla, Graham heard family noise. When Prescott corrected her, Graham heard tradition. When Prescott grabbed her wrist, Graham saw a problem but not one larger than his fear. I have prosecuted men who did active evil with both hands. Graham was not that. Graham was the man who kept his hands clean by keeping them still. The result for my daughter was not much different. The investigation widened slowly, and because I had spent most of my adult life inside federal procedure, I knew the machinery by the sound it made before anyone else in town heard it. Agents came through Livingston once, not to interview Leela about the assault, because that remained separate, but to ask me about the old file. I gave them what I had. Notes from a witness interview in 2014, a memo I had written and never sent up the chain, because by then the witness had recanted, and the budget had shifted toward a narcotics task force. Old emails, a name scribbled in the margin of a yellow legal pad. The agents were young enough that one of them called me sir too often, and the other tried not to look impressed by the boxes in my garage, labeled by year and case category. I told them not to admire organization too much, because it is usually just anxiety with shelves. They smiled politely. When they left, Leela stood in the doorway of the kitchen, arms folded, watching their car pull away. She said, "Does this make me the reason?" I said, "No." She said, "If I had not called you, would any of this happen?" I said, "Maybe not now. Maybe not this way." She looked stricken. I said, "That does not make you the cause. It makes you the door the truth used, because every other door had been nailed shut." She did not answer, but later that night, I found her reading on the couch for the first time since she came home, which I took as a small mercy. Prescott tried to control the narrative, of course. Powerful men do not fall without first attempting to choreograph the descent. Through friends of friends, through the kind of town gossip that travels faster than subpoenas, I heard versions of the story that made me sound unstable, resentful, jealous of Marlowe money, unable to accept that my daughter had married above herself. There were whispers that Leela had always been emotional, that teaching had made her fragile, that she and Graham had private marital difficulties no one understood. One woman at the grocery store, someone I barely knew, touched my sleeve near the canned tomatoes and said she hoped Leela was getting the help she needed. I looked at her hand until she removed it. Then I said, "She is getting the truth she needed." The woman flushed and retreated toward the bakery. I did not enjoy that exchange, but I did not regret it. Lies survive on politeness. They breed in rooms where decent people are too tired to correct them. I was tired, but I had years of correction left in me. Leela's worst day came not during the indictment, not during the divorce hearing, but on an ordinary Thursday in December when a box arrived from Whitefish. It had no return name, just her married initials written in Vivian's narrow hand. Inside were things from the bedroom she had shared with Graham, packed neatly, almost tenderly. A scarf, 2 books, a pair of earrings I had given her when she graduated college, a framed photograph from the wedding. Under those, wrapped in tissue, was the cream turtleneck she had worn the day I arrived, cleaned, folded, smelling faintly of cedar. Leela took it out and held it, as if she had lifted an animal found dead on the road. Then she went very still. I said her name. She did not answer. She walked to the back porch in socks, opened the door, and stood in the cold with the sweater in her hands. I followed but did not touch her. After a long time she said, "I wore this because the bruise was not the only one." I felt the world narrow again. She touched the back of her neck. "He shoved me into the bathroom wall the night before I called you." Graham, not Prescott. He said I was making his life impossible. He said his father was right, that I did not know how to fit. Then he cried afterward and said he was sorry, and that I had to understand what pressure he was under. She looked at the sweater. I believed the crying more than the shove. "That is the part I cannot forgive myself for." I said, "That is the part he counted on." Her knees weakened then. I caught her before she hit the porch boards. We stayed there in the cold until she could stand. That was the day the story changed inside me. Until then, some small disciplined part of me had kept Graham in a category separate from Prescott. Weak, complicit, afraid, guilty by omission, but not the same. The bathroom wall put him somewhere else, not because one shove mattered more than one silence, but because it revealed the shape of the silence. Graham had not merely failed to protect her from his father. He had learned from him. He had taken the family language of control and translated it into a softer voice, one with apologies afterward, one that asked to be understood. I called Leela's attorney that afternoon with her permission. I called Danny Mercer too, though that part concerned state law more than federal prosecution. I did not demand. I had promised myself long ago never to become the old prosecutor who mistakes his history for authority in someone else's office. I simply gave information and asked for proper referrals. By evening, Leela had an appointment with a counselor who specialized in coercive control and domestic abuse. She resisted the phrase. Domestic abuse sounded to her like something that happened to other women, women with worse bruises, women who called shelters, women who appeared in training videos. The counselor, a calm woman named Dr. Say, told her during the first session, "Abuse is not measured by how much worse someone else had it. It is measured by what someone did to make you smaller." Leela came home from that session silent. Then she slept 12 hours. When the grand jury subpoenaed records from Marlowe Timber Holdings, the family finally turned on itself. That is how empires fail, not because enemies breach the wall, but because the people inside begin calculating who can be sacrificed to preserve the furniture. Elise's husband cooperated. Vivian gave a statement through counsel, that was so carefully worded it sounded like grief wearing gloves. Graham claimed he knew nothing about the business irregularities and probably told the truth in the narrowest legal sense. But civil truth and moral truth are different species. He knew how his father operated. They all did. They knew which contractors were invited to bid and which were warned away. They knew which county officials received hunting trips and which state inspectors suddenly got consulting offers after retirement. They knew enough to enjoy the benefits and not enough, they hoped, to be liable. That is the preferred ignorance of comfortable people. They do not ask who is bleeding under the floorboards because the house is warm. The trial brought reporters to town, not many at first, then more when the witness who had once recanted testified that two men connected to Prescott had visited him after dark and explained what would happen to his brother's logging contract if he kept talking. Prescott's defense lawyers objected to nearly everything. They suggested memory had degraded. They suggested political motivation. They suggested old grudges, misunderstanding, administrative complexity. The jury listened the way Montana juries listen, with faces that give lawyers ulcers. When the verdict came in, Layla did not attend. She was teaching that day. She had decided she would not give Prescott another hour of her life unless compelled. I was at home when Danny called. Guilty on most counts, he said. I thanked him. After we hung up, I drove to Leela's school and waited in the parking lot until the bell rang. Children poured out around me in bright coats. Leela saw my truck and came over slowly. She knew. I told her. She closed her eyes. I expected relief. Instead, she said, I wish Mom were here. I said, me too. She said, I wish none of this had happened. I said, me too. Then she went back inside because she had left her lunchbox in the classroom. The sentencing months later was colder. Prescott spoke because men like him cannot resist one more performance. He expressed regret for any procedural mistakes. He spoke of family legacy, employees depending on him, charitable contributions, the fragility of the regional economy. He did not mention the witness. He did not mention the bids. He did not mention Layla, of course, because legally she was not the point of that proceeding, which was true and also obscene. The judge, a woman I respected, listened without expression. When she sentenced him to 11 years, Prescott's mouth opened slightly, not in remorse but in offended disbelief. The belief that consequences are for other men had survived the indictment, the trial, the verdict, and most of the sentencing hearing. It died only when the number was spoken aloud. 11, a simple number, 2 syllables, enough to make an old rich man grip the table the way he had gripped my daughter's wrist. I wish I could say that was the end of the wait. It was not. The public consequences did not erase the private damage. Layla had to relearn ordinary freedom. The first time she bought a bright red coat because she liked it, she called me from the store to ask whether it was too much. I said, too much for what? She said, I do not know. That answer broke me more than the question. The first time she went to dinner with colleagues and came home late, she apologized before remembering no one was angry. The first time someone at school touched her arm to get her attention, she flinched so visibly the other teacher apologized and nearly cried. Leela comforted the woman who had accidentally startled her, then came home furious at herself for making someone else feel bad. Recovery is full of such humiliations, not grand setbacks, small betrayals by your own nervous system. A door closes too loudly, and your body votes before your mind does. A man laughs in another room, and you measure the exits. Someone says good girl to a dog on the sidewalk, and your stomach turns. I learned to stop saying, you are safe now, because safety is not a fact another person can hand you. Instead I said, you are here. This is my kitchen. That is snow on the window. The dog is stealing your sock. Little by little, the present became more persuasive. Sometimes late at night, when the house settled and Leela was asleep down the hall, I sat at the kitchen table and allowed myself to imagine the version of that dinner where I had lost control. It is not pleasant to admit, but honesty matters here. I imagined crossing the table. I imagined breaking Prescott's hand. I imagined Graham on the floor. Those images came uninvited, hot and vivid, and for a few seconds they satisfied something primitive in me. Then the prosecutor in me, the father in me, the man Nora had loved, would take them apart. Violence would have made me the story. It would have given them the weapon they wanted. It would have taught Layla that even rescue arrives as another explosion. Setting down the napkin had been harder. Quiet had been harder. Patience, that old rough tool, had done what rage could not. But the fact that I chose patience does not mean rage vanished. It lives in me still. I have simply built a fence around it. The last time I saw Graham was outside the courthouse after a divorce status conference. He had lost weight. His expensive coat hung off him strangely, as if borrowed from the man he used to be. He approached me while Layla was inside with her attorney. I watched him come and wondered whether he had rehearsed. He stopped 6 feet away. "Calvin," he said. I did not answer. He looked down, then up. "I loved her." I said. "I believe you loved what she gave you." He flinched. "That is not fair." I said. "Fair is not available today." He rubbed his hands together, though it was not cold. "My father is not an easy man." I said. "Your father is not the reason you put your hands on her." His face changed. "As she told you." I let the silence answer. He looked away toward the courthouse steps. "I was under pressure." I said. "So was she." He whispered. "I am not like him." That was the plea. Not forgive me. Not I hurt her. Not tell her I am sorry. I am not like him. I said. "Then spend the rest of your life proving it somewhere she does not have to watch." He walked away. I have not seen him since. Layla did eventually go to coffee with the history teacher. His name is Owen. He is careful without being timid, which is a distinction I have come to value. The first time he came to my house, he brought bread from a bakery and asked whether he should take off his shoes. He did not touch Layla without her moving toward him first. He did not interrupt her stories. When she disagreed with him about some minor school board issue, he listened and changed his mind halfway through because she had made a better point. I watched that more closely than I watched anything else. Any man can bring bread. Not every man can be corrected without shrinking or striking back. After dinner, while Leela was in the kitchen, Owen asked me whether I worried about her. I said yes. He said, "I do too, but I am trying not to make that her burden." I looked at him then with real attention. "That sounds like meaningful work," I said. He smiled. "It is." Still, nothing about Owen healed the Marlowe years. I do not believe people heal each other like that. They can offer shelter. They can offer witness. They can offer a room where no one raises a hand, but the work remains inside the person who survived. Layla knows this. Some days she is brave in ways that look ordinary from a distance. She answers a phone call. She wears short sleeves. She tells Owen she needs to go home early instead of forcing herself to stay pleasant. She says no to a committee at school. She buys the green dress. Each choice is small enough for the world to miss, and large enough for me to see the mountain inside it. When people ask me how she is doing, I say she is living. That is the most accurate answer. Living is harder than sounding fine. As for me, I am changed too, though nobody asks old men that question unless we are visibly dying. The world assumes fathers absorb impact like fence posts. We stand where we are put and weather what hits us. But that night entered me. I see hands differently now. A man reaching for a woman's arm in a restaurant. A father gripping a child too hard in a parking lot. A husband guiding his wife by the back of the neck, as if affection and steering are the same thing. I see it all, and sometimes I have to remind myself that not every touch is a crime. Not every room is that dining room, but I no longer give the benefit of the doubt as freely as I once did. Maybe that is a loss. Maybe it is wisdom arriving late and main. The Marlowe estate is still there above the lake. Of course it is. Houses like that outlast scandals. Someone keeps the drive plowed. Someone polishes the silver. Vivian lives in one wing, according to what I hear, and Elise manages what remains of the family business under supervision from people who know where the bodies are buried financially, if not literally. Prescott will be older when he comes out. Smaller too, I imagine. Prison makes men like him furious, because it is one of the few places where inherited land cannot widen a cell. I do not think about him often, but when I do not picture the courtroom. I picture his fingers opening on Leela's wrist. The first defeat was not the verdict. It was the release, the moment he obeyed a man he had mistaken for harmless. This story does not end with a wedding, though perhaps someday there will be one. It does not end with laughter around my table, though there is some of that now. It does not end with me feeling proud of how I handled everything, because pride is too clean a word for a night built out of fear, strategy, love, and old rage. It ends, if it ends anywhere, with the knowledge that protection is not a speech you give after harm has passed. It is a posture you practice before the room turns dangerous. It is attention. It is knowing your child's lying tale at 4 years old and remembering it when she is 29. It is driving through black ice because her voice has gone flat. It is sitting through dinner when every nerve wants war because you understand the value of witnesses. It is acting without becoming the kind of violence you oppose. It is standing up, yes, but it is also waiting until standing up will hold. There are nights when I still wake before dawn and walk down the hall to check the spare room, even though Leela no longer sleeps there. Habit is a ghost with keys. The room is empty now except for folded blankets and a box of school supplies she has not picked up. The blue quilt is on the bed. Sometimes I stand in the doorway and remember her at 16 after Nora died, curled under that quilt with her hair across her face. And then I remember her at 29 in the same bed, sleeping like a person dragged from deep water. I think about all the versions of her I have failed and saved and loved. Fatherhood is not one job. It is a lifetime of being called back to the same promise under different weather. Keep watch, tell the truth, stand when needed, stay afterward. If there is anything left to say, it is this. The world is full of polished tables where harm is made to look like etiquette. It is full of men who call cruelty tradition, cowardice loyalty, silence discretion, and control love. It is full of families who will ask the wounded person to lower her voice because the truth makes dinner uncomfortable. Do not be fooled by the table. Do not be fooled by the chandelier, the money, the name on the gate, the attorney smiling into his wine. Watch the hands. Watch who flinches. Watch who looks down. Watch who becomes smaller when a certain person enters the room. The truth is almost always there before anyone speaks it. And when the moment comes, when the hand closes around the wrist, when the room waits to see whether decency has a spine, put your napkin down carefully. Look the person in the eye. Speak clearly enough that the silence cannot swallow it. Then live with what follows. That is the cost. That is the work. That is the only inheritance worth leaving.